Welcome friends to this 8th lecture on the course on human behavior. Now, we will start off this lecture by quickly reviewing what we have done in the past 7 lectures. We started off in the first 2 lectures by introducing the field of human behavior and the field of psychology, and there we discussed things like why do we need this course on human behavior. The answers were probably to study what humans do and how they do, and is required because humans being like to have much better interaction or a much better life than they normally are having. We then looked at the history of how the course of human behavior or the study of human behavior progressed. We started by describing questions from physiology, questions from philosophy, which led to the study of human behavior. Questions like what is the soul, what is the mind, how the soul manifests the mind, what is behavior, and questions like that. Also, whether the mind and soul are they blank at the time when somebody is born, or they come with pre-experiences. So, this is the philosophical questions. On the physiological side, questions like how does the mind do what it does, how it controls the body, and all that kind of questions. So, that was the basic history of how the field started off and from where did it break. Then we looked at the history of the psychology itself, which is the science which studies human behavior, and we looked at some primitive schools like structuralist school, functionalist schools, the 2 early schools, and the Gestalt school, which is a direct opposition to the structuralist school. We also looked at 2 more schools, the behaviorist school, which is entirely different from what the structuralist, behaviorists and gestaltists do, because they say that human behavior or human actions are kind of a reflex. So, there is no organism or there is no intelligent being in between. And then finally, the idea of psychoanalysis or the psychoanalytic school, which believes that most human behavior comes from hidden desires in the unconscious. We also looked at certain paradigms and certain new sciences which has now come up with psychology, like psycholinguistics, cognitive neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience, and things like that. Towards the end of this lecture, we looked at some fields of psychology, and we also looked at how to do research in psychology. For example, the methods of experimentation, the methods of observation, literature review, and all other methods of doing psychology or studying human behavior. The next set of lectures were on understanding those receptors or understanding those processes and systems which encode the physical stimulus into the psychological world. And there we looked at 2 parameters of systems and processes which encode the physical stimulus into the psychological realm. So, 2 parameters that we focused on was sensitivity and sensory coding, and in sensitivity we looked at 2 sensitivities. We looked at 2 basic thresholds or 2 basic parameters of sensitivity or 2 basic characteristics of sensitivity, which is defining the absolute and the differential threshold. Further to on, we looked at something called signal detection theory, which describes how human beings make intelligent guesses or human beings detect stimuluses in the environment. Now, the reason for understanding or bringing up the theory of signal detection in humans, but not in most other physical devices or physical devices which measure or which encode information or detect information, is that human mind or human brain, it has a lot of background noise, and this noise is created by those functions which make humans live. So, all those functions which carry out your everyday day-to-day activities, the autonomic functions, they create a lot of noise, and so human beings have to detect external stimuluses or encode external stimuluses on the background of these noises, and so the theory of signal detection comes in. Now, within the theory we have described how the theory really works and what are the parameters of the theory and what are the characteristics of the theory. So, those are the things that we discussed there, and further to on we looked at those biological process or those biological systems which encode the physical stimulus into the biological stimulus. Towards the end of that lecture, we took a model system, which is the human eye, and explained to you how the human eye functions, and how whatever we have read or whatever we have discussed in terms of sensations and sensory perceptions, how does they function in relation to the human eye. Then we looked at something called perception. Now, what is perception? When the sensory system encodes information into the psychological realm, a meaning has to be generated from that particular stimulus or that particular information. And so, perception is basically the way of generating meaning from those stimuluses or those information which has been inputted to the sensory systems. Now, perception, as we discussed, is a 5-part process. It starts by putting up attention, which is basically focusing on what information to grab and what information not to grab, and how does this attention work. This was the subject matter of that particular section. Then we looked at something called localization, which is basically locating where the physical stimulus that has been encoded, where it is in the external environment. And this is necessary because any kind of navigation, any kind of mapping has to be done on locating the external stimulus in the environment. The third step is basically the recognition process, which basically defines how humans recognize what they are seeing in the external environment or what has been encoded in through the sensory systems into the human brain. So, recognition is a 2-part process. There is something called early recognition and there is something called late recognition. Within early recognition, it is all about feature detection, the binding problem, and that kind of how primitive information is glued together and information is extracted out of it. And within the later recognition, the comparison or the matching, data matching goes on. So, here what happens is we whatever information comes from the simpler steps or from the primary recognition steps, those information or those information bits are then compared across multiple multiple information models which have been already stored in the brain, and this is called the later recognition process. So, basically it is pattern matching, kind of pattern matching. So, you have a pattern which has been generated from the sensory systems, and there are some patterns which are already pre-saved in the brain. So, how do you match that is what the later recognition systems is all about. And so, there are several models. We have the simple model and we have the complex model, and so simple model is a one-way model and the complex model is a feedback feed forward kind of a model. So, that is what we did in the idea of how recognition happens. Further to that, there are 2 more steps to it. One is the idea of abstraction, how the human brain extracts those information which it finds necessary from any kind of perception that it is having, any kind of information that it is having, and then the idea of constancy, which is maintaining certain ratios or maintaining certain constants in terms of the physical stimulus that the human brain is actually seeing. Further to that, we ended the section by integrating and showing you how this perception really works. Now, in the last class, which was the first section on learning, we looked at what is learning and what is the need of it. And so, we described learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior, which is basically happening through experience. So, parts of it is relatively and permanent. So, it is relative to something, and it is relatively permanent in the sense that learning can always go back. And relatively permanent change in what? Change in the behavior. So, basically it says that the behavior can always change back, and then it happens. How does it happen? It happens through experience in previous memories. So, part of learning or more of learning is in terms of memories and past experiences. And a related concept to learning is memory, which we will see in the upcoming section. Further to that, we took to understanding what is learning or what learning is all about, and we saw there are 2 types of learning. We have something called the non-associative form and we have something called the associative form. So, what is the difference? In the non-associative form, a single stimulus is what causes learning, or the learning is based on the single stimulus. two finds exist, one is sensitization, the other is the habituation, and so there is some primary differences with that which we looked in the last lecture. Since our interest is more into associative form of learning, we took one of the forms of associative learning. Now, associative forms of learning is basically a form of learning where we make associations between multiple stimuluses or a stimulus and a response, and that leads to betterment of behavior or change in behavior. And so, within the associative form we have three different forms of learning. We have the classical conditioning, we have the instrumental conditioning, and then we have the complex learning, or basically the observational learning. And so, we will start with a brief review of what we did in the last class. So, associative learning is divided into the classical conditioning, the operant conditioning, or sometimes it is called instrumental conditioning, and then we have something called observation learning. So, we did the classical conditioning in the last class, so we will focus very less into it. What is the primary difference? In classical conditioning, you have a reward which is given upfront. So, a reward is given with a particular kind of a stimuli, and due to this what happens is the learning happens. Right. So, it is reward contingent, which means that reward leads to learning. In instrumental conditioning, what really happens is that the subject he does as a response, and if this response produces consequences, if the response produces positive consequence, the behavior increases. If the reward produces negative consequence, the behavior decreases. And so, in this case the learning is not reward contingent, it is response contingent. So, you do something, a particular act, and because of that certain either you get rewarded or you get beaten up, and so depending on what kind of consequence you get, your behavior or basically your chances, probability of doing that act is defined by your response or the consequence of the response. In observation learning, what happens is people keep on learning, or the learning happens by observing someone, observing a role model, and so observing models, or I would say observing role models, and we look at all the acts that the role model is doing, and if the acts are rewarding, the acts of the role model are rewarding, we actually learn it. If the acts are non-rewarding, those acts we do not learn. And so, since we have already done classical conditioning, let us start by investigating what is operant conditioning. And as I said, in operant conditioning what happens is you operate on certain behaviors. So, if there is a stimulus and this stimulus leads to a particular response, this response may have multiple consequences. If you have a positive consequences, the chance of you doing this act, repeating that act increases, and this is lead to high behavior or high probability of repeating that act. If the consequence, so this is my response and this is my consequence. If the consequence is negative, the chances are that the repetition of this behavior will be very less in future. And so, let us take an example. So, let us say that you show anger, that you, if somebody says something bad to you, you show anger. Now, a bad word, a swear word is said to you, and because of that you respond by anger. If this anger leads to the other person running away, this is a positive response, right. And so, you in all cases where people tell you swear word, you will be angry. But in other words, if you show anger to a swear word, if somebody says you a swear word, and what happens as a result of it, people do not run away, but they beat you up, then the chances of showing anger as a response to swear word will decrease, and this is as simple as you can get to what is operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning is more better conditioning. The reason being that classical conditioning only works with natural stimuluses. Now, you have to remember that in classical conditioning what we saw is that there is something called the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. So, the unconditioned response, which is the salivation that we were getting, has to be already linked with the meat powder. If the meat powder does not produce salivation on its own to start with, we cannot pair a tone to the meat powder and then get the tone to produce the salivation. But if we want someone to learn a novel behavior, for example, if I want my dog to respond to salivation through a tone, I can use classical conditioning because it is reward contingent. But suppose I want the dog to do something extra. I want the dog to actually roll on the floor or get me my paper. Now, if that is the question which I want, the dog is not going to learn by classical conditioning. So, what I do is instrumental conditioning. I will reward the dog if he brings the paper to me, or if he approaches towards the paper or anywhere near the paper or fiddles with the paper. So, I will keep on rewarding. So, the dog now understands that if instead of wandering around, if he grabs the paper in his mouth and he brings it to me, or if he supposedly grabs the paper, newspaper or letter or any matter of the fact of that behavior which we have been training, if he does something like that, then he gets a reward. So, he does that particular act again and again. And so, if we want someone to learn an unusual behavior, to learn a behavior which he is not linked to, which he has not been doing previously, the conditioning or the learning that you have to use is something called instrumental conditioning. So, let us start with what is instrumental conditioning, the definition of it. Now, what is instrumental conditioning? If you look into it, instrumental conditioning has been defined as that it involves learning the relationship between responses and outcome. So, basically if there is a stimulus and this stimulus produces responses, let us say a stimulus produces two responses, response 1 and response 2. Now, response 1 leads to positive consequence and response 2 leads to negative consequences. What will happen? People will actually do response 1 and not do response 2. The reason being that instrumental conditioning is learning what response leads to what consequence. Now, also it may so happen that if you have a stimulus and the stimulus response, the response to the stimulus might give two consequences, a positive consequence and a negative consequences. Now, on cases when it is giving positive consequences, people tend to do this act again and again, but if it is giving a negative consequence or a negative feedback out of it, people will not do this this act. Now, this particular theory or this particular idea that positive consequences lead to increased behavior is what is called the law of effect. The law of effect was proposed by Thorndike, E. L. Thorndike, and what E. L. Thorndike actually said is that those acts which are led by a positive consequences, people associate these positive consequences to the response that they are giving, and that increases the likelihood of doing that behavior again and again. But if a thought or if it is if a particular act leads to negative consequences, people relate this with the idea that not doing this behavior or avoiding this behavior, and so that is what the law of effect is all about. Now, Thorndike carried out experimentation where animals engaged in trial and error learning, whereby behavior strengthened immediately followed by reward or law of effect. And so, what was the original experiment of Thorndike? In Thorndike's original experiment, what he did was he took a cat, and let me see if I have Thorndike's experiment. So, what Thorndike did was he took a cat and put the cat in a simple maze. So, I have a maze like this, right, and this has a door, a latch. So, what Thorndike did was put a cat in this. This is my cat. Of course, you have to bear with me in terms of the drawing, and so this is a latch, this is what the door is, and just outside the cage is fish. right, some live fish. Yeah, of course funny, but you have to bear with me. So, here is my cat, and what Thorndike actually did was took this cat and put into this particular kind of an enclosure and put the latch onto this thing. Now, when the cat was put in and there was fish outside, the first act that the cat did was raised its elbow and raised its paws and tried to get the fish, but when it did not get the fish, it started going all around the cage and doing all kinds of behavior. Now, what happens is, one of the times she actually hit the latch and the latch opened, the cat could come out and eat the fish. As soon as that happened, Thorndike again took this cat inside this particular cage, and the cat again did some of the behaviors, and so for multiple versions of it, what happened is cat actually did most of the behaviors that was happening. But as time progressed, what Thorndike saw is that many of the irrelevant behaviors the cat stopped doing, and there was a time when as soon as the cat was put into the cage, it actually opened the latch and started eating the fish, and that is what is the law of effect. The cat realized that doing all this unnecessary behavior, it learned by something called trial and error. So what it learned is that doing unnecessary behaviors is not going to reward it. So it learned the behavior that what I have to do is open this particular latch, and if I open this latch, the door is going to open and I can get the fish. And so what Thorndike said is that is what is basically the idea of trial and error, and this is how people learn, or in this case the cat learned about the fact that it is going to get the food. Now, another kind of experiment that was done on instrumental conditioning was done by someone called B.F. Skinner. So, Skinner's experiment was more simpler than what Thorndike did, and so what was the experiment? Now, Skinner's experiment involves putting a hungry animal in a box which is bare except for a bar with food dish under. Now, animal's initial rate of pressing bar through exploration is the baseline level. And so, what Thorndike actually did was he designed a more simpler experiment. In this experiment, as you can see, this is a rat, right, and so the rat has been put in this particular kind of a box. Now, this box has one lever, and as you can see, the lever is here somewhere. This is where the lever is, and what the mouse has to do, the mice has to do is press this lever. Now, initially, and this lever is attached to a food pipe. So, as you can see, this is food grain and this is a food pipe, and this is an electronic system which tells how to deliver the food. And so, what the rat actually does is, and this cage is empty, there is nothing here except one lever which is there. What the rat actually does is, initially the rat does not do anything, so it keeps on doing a lot of things, and so it in one of those times it presses this lever. When it presses this lever, it gets the food. So, what the rat realizes is pushing this lever actually delivers the food. And so, when he realized that, he started pushing the lever more and more and started getting more food, or food at a very higher rate. So, initially how this experiment was done, initially there was no food given to the rat, and so a baseline was established. It was seen that how many times the rat actually pressed the lever, and that was called the baseline of pressing, or the baseline level of pressing. After that, what happened is, the rat was then a paradigm was formed in which the food was released, and so the more number of times, or the more number of presses that the rat was doing, the more number of food it was getting, and that was the experiment which Skinner had designed for itself, and it is a more simpler experiment to understand how this instrumental learning actually works, or instrumental conditioning actually works. And so, what is happening here, as the rat pushes the lever, there is consequence. So, more you push, the higher push you do, the higher consequence is high food. And so, what the rat is, the more push, you will get less food. So, what the rat started doing is pressing it higher and higher and getting the food. Now, acquisition and extinction. Now, similar to the acquisition and extinction that we have seen in classical conditioning, acquisition and extinction also happens in instrumental conditioning. What is it? Now, how do the rat acquire something, and how does the extinction happen? So, after the baseline is established, each time the bar is pressed, food is released, which results in frequent pressing of the bar. Now, this is the acquisition part of instrumental conditioning. Remember acquisition in classical conditioning, how does it really work? What happens in classical conditioning is the more number of pairings that you do, the more frequent pairings that you do of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So, in terms of classical conditioning, the neutral stimulus plus the unconditioned stimulus, the more number of pairings that you do, the more is the unconditioned response and better is the learning. And this is these trials in which the neutral stimulus is paired with unconditioned stimulus is called the acquisition stage. In instrumental conditioning, after establishing a baseline, because you do not know how many presses or how much the rat was already pressing, and so how many times the rat is going to press the lever. So, we first establish something called the baseline, and baseline is the value or baseline is the number of presses the rat is doing of the lever irrespective of it is given a food or not. Once the baseline is established, the food is started being released each time the lever is being pressed. Now, if food stops being released, then similar extinction of response as in classical conditioning happens. So, both acquisition and extinction. In extinction, do you remember what is extinction in classical conditioning? So, what happens is at a point of time what happens is when the neutral stimulus is given, which now becomes the classic the conditioned stimulus starts giving the conditioned response. So, the tone produces the salivation, but sooner or later the dog realizes that it is the tone which is making him salivate and he stops, and this is what is called extinction. In terms of my instrumental conditioning also, there will be a point when the rat will not get any food by pressing the lever, and so if the food stops being released, then the rat will not press the lever anymore, and this is what is extinction. As you can see here, this is where my rat is, this is where my food particles is, and the person who is sitting here and designing something on the computer is how many trials will I actually give the food. And this is very funny because it tells will press lever for food. So, this is the rat who goes into this box and presses the lever for food. Interesting. Another experiment that B.F. Skinner did was with pigeons, and so what he did was he was teaching something called avoidance learning, and it's a little bit higher than instrumental conditioning, because what is being taught to this pigeon is to respond to green light and not respond to red light. And so the basic response to the pigeon is that it pecks. So what Skinner did was he created a pecking system like this, and so there are two lights here, a green light and a red light, and when the green light comes in, food comes in, but if the red light is flashed, food does not come in. And so what the pigeon learned is to respond to the green line and not to the respond to the red light, and that is what is there. So, pigeon sitting, pigeon pecking key, pigeon being rewarded, that is what it is. You will see the food, and so this particular experiment was to find out whether people can discriminate between, or pigeons can discriminate between two different versions of the same stimulus which has been given to it, or two versions of the response, two versions of the stimuli which has been given to it. So, can it discriminate that, and can it also study the consequence, because the consequence will tell if the behavior will increase or not. Now, what is the nature of operant conditioning? Let us have a look at that. Now, in operational conditioning or operant conditioning, the probability that a given behavior will occur changes depending on the consequence that follows it. As I have said again and again, what happens in operant conditioning is that you do a particular act, you do a particular behavior to a particular stimulus. Let us say that somebody hits you, you become angry, this is the response. Now, if the anger is rewarded in some way, the consequence, what is the consequence of anger? There can be two consequences. If you, by being angry, you make the other person who has said bad words to you run away, this is a positive consequence. But in other case, if you become angry, the other person also becomes angry, and the feud comes in, or you get beaten up by the other person, then it is a negative consequence. Now, if it is rewarded in the sense that the person who says bad words actually moves away or runs away, then the positive consequence is there, and so you will do this behavior being angry, on when somebody says a swear word, that will repeat it again and again. But in the other case is the other way around. If you see that somebody says a swear word to you and he beats you also, then you are not going to be angry anymore. That is what it's all about. Now, these probabilities are determined through 4 basic procedures, 2 which strengthen or increase reinforcement and 2 which weaken or decrease, which is the punishment. So, there are 2 terms to be noted, one is called reinforcement and the other is called so the consequences that I have can lead to reinforcements or punishment, right. The consequences that happens in instrumental conditioning can lead to a reinforcement or a punishment. Now, what is reinforcement? There are 2 types of reinforcement. So, we will see this reinforcement. Reinforcement is a consequence of a particular behavior. And so, what is reinforcement? The application or removal of a stimulus to increase the strength of a specific behavior. They are of 2 classes. Now, if you do a particular act and because of that, or if you get a particular kind of a consequence and because of that consequence you increase the probability of doing that behavior again and again, this is called positive reinforcement, right. So, what happens is, if by doing a particular act an aversive an appetitive stimuli, if by the inclusion of an appetitive stimuli, if I know appetitive is basically, first let me define what is appetitive. There are 2 types of stimuli, one is appetitive, which is a positive stimuli or liking stimuli, and the other is called the aversive stimuli, which is the one which is a negative one. Now, if an appetitive stimuli, so let us say this is your behavior, if this behavior leads to an appetitive stimuli because of which a behavior increases, you say that this is positive reinforcement, right. So, basically how it is, the consequence, if an appetitive stimuli leads to an increase in behavior, this is called positive a positive reinforcement, and if the removal of an aversive stimuli, if appetitive stimuli is included, behavior increases, this is positive reinforcement. If an aversive stimuli is removed and that leads to increase in behavior, this is called negative reinforcement. Now, let me first explain to you what it is. It is very easy to understand. If by including or removing a stimuli a behavior increases or the chance of a behavior increases, that is called reinforcements. Now, there are 2 classes of reinforcements, we will look at punishments also, and I will also give you a lot of examples of how these are. What is positive reinforcement? It involves the impact of positive reinforcers, stimuli, events or consequences that strengthen responses that precedes them. Let us say that you do something good, you get very good in exam, good marks in exam, and because of getting this good marks, you actually get a bicycle from your parents. Now, the chances are, what is the chance? The chances are that always you will do good in exam, because you never did this act of getting good marks because of the bicycle, because it was not promised at all. And so, what happens is that you actually did good in exam on your own, and that was followed by a positive consequences, and the positive consequences is the act of getting a bicycle or getting a reward, any reward it could be, and because of that you are happy now, and so you will do good in exam, because now what has happened is doing good in exam actually gives you a reward. So, what happens here is that the initial behavior, which is doing good in exam, was not rewarded at all. Had it been rewarded, it would be classical conditioning, but the very act of getting good marks led to a particular positive act, a particular positive reward that you get, and this is called positive reinforcement. But let us say that you want to study, right, or you have friends who are intolerable in your hostel room who are sitting. Now, one way to understand is positive reinforcement. So, what you will do is, since you do not want to get into any kind of trouble, you will avoid going to your room when your friends are present who are very abusive. And so, here what happens is, an aversive stimulus, and by removing a stimulus, what happens is you are feeling positive or you are rewarded. So, by not going into your room, you are rewarded because you do not face that situation where you have to fight or tolerate these friends of yours who are very unlikable. So, friends of yours who are sitting in your room and very intolerable, and you do not want to meet them, what you do is you avoid the room altogether, do not go to the room, and that leads to positive consequences, because then you do not have to fight with these people or say anything to these people. And so this leads to positive behavior, because each time you see these friends together, you will avoid them, and by avoiding them you feel happy, and so this is called negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement is a situation in which a stimulus is taken away, an aversive stimulus is removed, something that you do not like is removed, and because of that what happens is you feel good, and so you do this behavior again and again, right. So something that is to be avoided. So negative reinforcement, as I have already explained, involves the impact of negative reinforces, stimuli that strengthen responses that permit an organism to avoid or escape from their presence. So in one case, if you do good in an exam and because of that you get a reward, you do that behavior again and again, this is called positive reinforcement. In the other case, you avoid your friends because they are not good, and by avoiding you feel better or you feel happy. So that is also a kind of reinforcement, a kind of reward, but this is called negative reinforcement. Similarly, there is a concept of punishment. What is punishment? It refers to the procedure that weakens or decreases the rate of a behavior. Now there are two classes. Remember that reinforcements increases behavior, whereas punishment, they decrease behavior. That is the primary difference, right. That has to be understood. See, punishment, if you give punishment, a particular behavior will decrease, but if you give reinforcement, a particular behavior is going to increase, and that is the difference between the two. And within the increase of behavior, there are two kinds. One is called the positive reinforcement, the other is called the negative reinforcement. Similarly, we have punishment, and so as I said, punishment is something applying a stimulus. So applying an aversive stimulus. So if you give an aversive stimulus, and because of that aversive stimulus behavior decreases, this is called positive punishment. Or in other case, if you take away an appetitive stimulus, if you take away something that the person wants, and because of that a particular behavior decreases, that is called negative punishment. So let us understand what they are. It refers to the procedure that weakens or decreases the rate of behavior. There are two classes. Positive punishment, behaviors are followed by aversive stimulus events that terminates that is termed as punishers. For example, let us say that you are two brothers, and so you fight among themselves, or you fight among yourself, and so you hit your smaller brother, he cries, and because of that you get a good beating from your parent. Now this behavior of hitting the brother, which leads to punishment, which leads to hitting by the parent, is a punishment, and so you will not do this behavior again and again, hitting a sibling, and that is called the positive punishment. But there is something negative, there is something called negative punishment also. So what has happened here is a negative stimulus, an aversive stimulus, inclusion of an aversive stimulus, beating leads to decrease. So beating you by the parent is the negative stimulus which has been included in the whole paradigm, and that leads to the decreased behavior of not hitting the sibling which you have done. Now negative punishment is a situation in which a positive stimulus is taken away from you, and because of that your behavior that you do to a particular stimulus will also decrease. Now the rate of behavior is weakened or decreased because the behavior is linked to the loss of a potential reinforcement. What happens here is that, let us say that you are driving on the road, right, and you do not have a helmet. Now one way is to find you there and for the helmet, but a better way to teach you is using negative reinforcement. It is also called omission training. Something that you like is taken away from you. So while you are not wearing a helmet, let us say the police wala takes away your license, or he takes away your vehicle only. Now the vehicle is something that you liked, and or the license is something that you like, and he took away the license instead of fining you for the particular crime that you did, which was not wearing a helmet. And so taking away something that you like, and by that punishing or decreasing your behavior, so you realize that each time you do not wear a helmet, the license will be taken away, and so now you start wearing the helmet. So taking away something you like and punishing you in that way to decrease behavior is what is called negative punishment. Now let us quickly look at some instrumental conditioning and the concept review table, types of reinforcement and punishment. So this is what my positive reinforcement look like, this is what my negative reinforcements look like, this is what my positive punishment look like, and this is what my negative punishment looks like. There is a definition, there is an effect, and there is an example. Quickly shift to the next one. Here the behavior, as you see, can be encouraged, here the behavior is suppressed. If you look here, this is where the stimulus is present, this is where the stimulus is removed. So, 4 different consequences. You have positive reinforcement here, you have the presentation punishment, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, and negative punishment. 4 different types and 4 different examples. Now, instrumental conditioning, the basic principles of instrumental conditioning. Now, in operant conditioning, organisms learn associations between particular behaviors and the consequences that will follow them. Now, in order to understand this form of learning, 2 issues need to be addressed. First, why are certain behaviors emitted in the first place, and the second is, once emitted, what factors determine the frequency with which this will be emitted. 2 things have to be understood in understanding the basic principles. Now, there are some related features with instrumental conditioning is the idea of shaping and chaining. And what is shaping and chaining? The shaping is getting behavior started and then putting it all together. Right. So, what is shaping? First of all, let us see, and then I will give you an example. So, shaping is a technique in which closer and closer approximation to a desired behaviors are required for the delivery of positive reinforcement. The organism undergoing shaping receives a reward for every small step towards the final goal, the target response, rather than only for the final response. And quickly related to this, or very much related to this, is the idea of chaining, which is a procedure that establishes a sequence of responses which lead to a reward following the final response in the chain. Training circus animals requires trainers to establish a sequence of chain of responses. The last one leads to the final reward. Let us say that I am training an elephant, or I want to train an elephant to ride a bicycle. How do I do that? Now, elephants do not ride bicycle, and so the only way to do that is first using shaping. So, I will give rewards to the elephant as soon as it reaches near the bicycle, it holds the bicycle, and so on and so forth. And chaining is basically dividing the whole behavior, right, from the point where the elephant gets interested in the bicycle to the point that it actually rides it. So, I will break the whole behavior into smaller parts. The reward is given to when it approaches near the bicycle, or when it does something, then it approaches the bicycle, then it touches it, then it sits on it, then it rides it, and so on and so forth. So, this behavior is broken down into several behaviors, and then all of them are chained together in a sequence or mixed together in a sequence. So, that finally from the point of time that the elephant was not interested in the bicycle to the point of time that an elephant is actually riding a bicycle. Now, by giving smaller rewards or rewards on each step of the way, I can make the elephant ride a bicycle. Always remember, classical conditioning happens with natural stimuluses, instrumental conditioning can happen with all kind of stimuluses, and so this is the pattern in which it actually works. Now, there are certain biological constraints also to instrumental conditioning. Now, as with classical conditioning, biology imposes certain constraints on what may be learned through instrumental conditioning. Organisms find it easier and faster to learn responses if their behavior required to make sense at the ethological level. For example, there are certain behaviors that certain animals do not do or certain animals do. For example, rats are very good at digging. So, if you want to teach it a behavior which is related to digging, it will always like it, but rats certainly do not like certain other kind of thing, for example, playing a flute or doing complex tasks. And if you want a rat to do that, what it will do is it will not like that or learn that behavior, or for that matter rats like digging. So, what happens is if you give a rat some money, or if you give a rat a counting task to do on a floor, what it will do is it will take the money and burrow it or bury it under the what do you say under the sand. Now, the proper behavior or the original behavior of the rat is burying things, and so if you give it something, it will actually burrow it. Right, it will not play with it, it will not demonstrate it, it will not learn anything from it, and so that is the biological constraint. Or in the case of elephants, elephants are not made to, or bears are not made to ride a bicycle. So, sometimes what will happen, if they feel very awkward or if they are not feeling good, they will take the bicycle and start hitting you with the bicycle, because the original response of the elephant is not riding the bicycle, but throwing the bicycle around with its tusk. And so, if it realizes it or somehow something goes wrong, it will start hitting you with the bicycle, and that is the natural response. Those are the biological constraints. Now, the role of reward delay in impulsiveness and procrastination, that is another thing to be read, or the basic principle of instrumental conditioning. Now, operant conditioning usually proceeds faster as the magnitude of reward that follows each response increases. The more number of rewards you give to people with each response, the higher the more reward that you get, the higher the behavior or higher the consequence of that behavior will increase. Now, but the effectiveness of reward can be dramatically affected by delay reward, how much time you are taking in between giving rewards. As I said, stimulus leads to response, which leads to consequence, which is reward, then behavior increases, and if it is a punishment, behavior decreases. Now, how long do you take to give rewards? That is also another effect which is there. Now, two factors to be the effect of reward delay can lead to, if the rewards are delayed, if the rewards are not given. So, this is if this is one trial, multiple trials are there, if the rewards are not given, or if the reward that you get out of doing a particular response, if it is delayed by some time, two factors can happen. Impulsiveness, the tendency to often choose smaller immediate rewards over rewards of greater value that they must wait for, is called impulsiveness. So, what happens is, if the reward delay is too much, what will happen is, the subjects or the person who is learning, he will choose smaller rewards and rather than the larger rewards. Also, something called procrastination, if the reward delay is longer, the procrastination also can happen. So, the tendency to put off until tomorrow what we should do today, the decision of facing procrastination is whether to perform a smaller, less effortful task now, or a larger, more effortful task later on. And so, what happens is, the reward is not given enough, or reward delay is there, people may also turn out to procrastination, saying that I will not do it today, I will do it tomorrow, and so on and so forth, and that kind of delay they can do. Instrumental conditioning basic principles. So, there is something called schedules of reinforcement, or different rules of delivery of payoffs. So, how do we give the reward, or what is the way of giving the reward? One of the ways of giving the reward is called the continuous reinforcement schedule. In what happens is, the reward is given for each kind of behavior. So, a schedule of reinforcement where every occurrence of a particular behavior is rewarded. So, every response that you get a reward. Fixed interval schedule, a schedule in which reinforcement for a specific interval of time must elapse before a response will yield. And so, here what happens is, a specific time elapses, and after that particular time a reward is given to you. Like you get a salary. So, after 30 days you get the salary. Variable interval schedule, a schedule of reinforcement in which a variable amount of time must elapse before a response will be given to you, or a reward will be given to you. For example, in this case you can have bonuses and all. Now, fixed ratio schedule, a schedule of reinforcement or schedule of reward in which reinforcement occurs only after a fixed number of responses have to be emitted. Here there are things like, when you work in a company, then you have to do a fixed amount of job, only then you will get the reinforcement, and so that is an example. And variable ratio schedule, a schedule of reinforcement in which reinforcement is delivered only after a variable number of responses have been performed. And so, here what happens is, for example, certain companies offer you bonuses, or certain payoffs, certain additional payoffs, that is what it is. And so, there is no way to determine when the payoff will be given to you, or certain kind of good things will be given, goodies are given to you, and that is the variable ratio schedule. What happens is, the variable amount of reinforcement, variable amount of work has to be done, and that will lead to the reward. Now, if you look at this, this is my time axis and this is my cumulative responses, the fixed ratio, the fixed interval, variable ratio, variable interval. And so, what happens is, which is the best one? The best one is variable ratio. This is the best way of rewarding people. As you can see, it is a line, and it is a line from 45-degree angle. Basic principles. Concurrent schedules of reinforcement and the matching law. There is some concurrent schedules also. So, concurrent schedules of reinforcement is a situation in which two or more behaviors, each having its own reinforcement schedules, are simultaneously available. This type of schedule has been used to study choice behavior in both animals and humans. Now, sometimes what we understand is that one type of reinforcement or one type of reward is not working. So, what we do is, we use two methods of rewarding people, one based on time, the other based on how much work you do. And so what is the matching law? States that the rate of response will match the rate of reinforcement which is provided, and each alternative behavior produces. In other words, a rat will distribute its behavior between alternatives in such a way so as to maximize the reinforcement it receives for its efforts. So if as soon as the employee understands that the reward is based sometimes on time and some rewards are based on time and some rewards are based on ratio, what it will do is, as soon as the time for the reward comes, he will start working more, and in terms of ratio what it will do is, it will work more on certain sectors or certain things on certain areas for getting the reward. So that is the matching law. Now there is also something called the stimulus control of behavior, signals about the usefulness or uselessness of a response. So how do somebody know that this response will lead to reward or not, and that is what it is called stimulus control of behavior. Now people and other animals, they readily learn to pay attention to cues in the environment that reliably signal certain consequences for their actions. Over time, people learn to make responses only to presence of these signals. This is called the discriminative stimulus. Stimuluses that signal the availability of a reinforcement if a specific response is made. In short, their behavior comes under something called stimulus control, consistent occurrence of a behavior in the presence of a discriminative stimulus. I will give you a good example to understand that. So, you read that and I will give you a good example. Let us say that this is the salary day, and mostly on salary days, if you want something from your father, you approach him, he is going to give you something good, some kind of a good gift. But then this is your parent coming in, the father coming in, and this is a salary day. So, you know that on a salary day ask him something, but then you see him in a bad mood. Do not approach him. This is called stimulus control of behavior. So, although it is salary day and if the stimulus is the salary day and you believe that he has had his money and he comes back in, but then there is a response that you are seeing, you see that he is not in a good mood, do not approach him, because if you approach him, you will never get what you want. And so, stimulus control of behavior is something like that. On most normal occasions, on a salary day, whatever you ask your father, you are going to get that. But if you see him in a bad mood on a salary day, never approach him, and that is called the stimulus control of behavior, because we look at this discriminative stimulus, which is the bad mood, which may not make him buy what you want to buy. So, do cognitive factors influence instrumental conditioning? Yes, several evidences seem to support the role of cognition in instrumental conditioning. For example, one is learned helplessness. It is the lasting effect produced by exposure to situations in which nothing an organism does work. No response yields reinforcement or provides escape from negative events. Now, this is learned helplessness is a technique which has been or a situation which has been defined by Martin Seligman. What happens is, if people see too many negative consequences or too many negatives happening in their life, they give up everything and they stop responding at all. This is called learned helplessness. Now, in this cases, if stimulus responses were based on the reward, what would happen, or one of those schedules of reinforcement would work, what will happen is that each consequence or each response that the subject does is independent of each other. But what happens is, in learned helplessness, people look at multiple negative consequences that has happened and they stop responding at all. That is called learned helplessness, a situation when people start believing that they cannot do anything in their life and they give up everything. And so that says that cognition works, because what happens here is, it is not stimulus which behavior or stimulus behavior related consequences which is telling you or which is making you learn. What has happened is, the thought process has made you not produce consequences or not produce responses to stimuluses, and so you never get a consequence out of it. Research suggests that learned helplessness stems partly from our perception of control. When we begin to believe that we have no control over our environment or our lives, we stop trying to improve the situation. Now, whereas stimulus gives to response and this response leads to consequences, when people start believing that these consequences are not in their control or not in the control of the responses that they are giving, they tend to do something called learned helplessness. In addition, genetic factors like inherited impairment in the ability to experience pleasure, for example hypohedonia, can also lead to learned helplessness. So, there are some genetic factors also which lead people to present this idea of learned helplessness. Now, there is also something called the contrast effect, which tells that cognition or cognitive factors decide operant conditioning. Now, behavior is influenced not only by the level of reward we receive by our evaluation of rewards related to our experience with the previous reward. So, it is not only that each stimulus is related to a particular reward which is related to a consequence. It is not as simple as that. this response that people give to a particular stimulus is dependent also on what previously responses we have given or what kind of reward we have actually received previously. Now, in this case what has happened is people when they were there's two group of people. One group of people were given high rewards, and one group of people were not given or actually any reward. And so when they were given high rewards, their behavior surpassed the behavior of people who had higher rewards. This is called the positive contrast. In the other case, people who were not given reward at all and people who were given some simple reward. So, people started when they were not given reward at all, their performance went very low. So, the experiment runs in this way, that when people were actually given some reward. Now, when the reward was increased, their behavior increased many folds in relation to what the reward was when a higher reward was given to them, and when a lower reward was given to them, their behavior actually went very low, below the standard in comparison to the reward. So, there is no relation between reward and behavior, and this is determined by previously how much you were given. So, initially what happened is a certain amount of reward was given to people, a certain amount of reward was given to people. When this reward was increased, behavior increased almost 3 times, but when this reward was decreased, behavior decreased by 3 times, and that basically says that there is a cognitive perspective. Now, shifts in the amount of reward we receive can dramatically influence performance. A temporal behavior shift termed as something called the contrast effect. Now, this can be of two types. We have a positive contrast. Positive contrast is when the behavior increases many-fold to the increase in reward, and negative contrast is when the behavior decreases many-fold in terms of the reward that is decreased. Now, the existence of contrast effect indicates the level of reward alone cannot always explain our behavior, and that experiences with a previously learned reward and consequence expectations can dramatically affect our performance. Now, there is another interesting thing in terms of whether cognition affects instrumental conditioning. And so, what happens here is that there were 3 group of rats. Actually, there were 2 group of rats. So, one rat was, and these rats were placed in a maze. So, we have something called a 8-arm radial maze, and so what happens is the rat was put here and a food was put here. So, one group of rats was actually given food and a reward, and so this rat, when given a reward, this group actually went ahead and started going from one end to the other, or trespassing this or traversing this radial maze. There were other group of rat who was not given anything, so they were put here, and this rat had no reward, and so they were not doing anything. Later on, the second group of rats who were not given a reward to start with, so no reward group was given a reward, and so when given a reward, these rats performed better than the rats who were actually given a reward to traverse this maze. And this basically says that what the rats who were not given a food, they were not just sitting down, they were traversing the maze, and they were learning something, and they formed something called the cognitive map, and this cognitive map actually helped them in traversing better than, or performing better than the rats who were getting no reward, and that is the reason that this rat perform better, which basically means that it is not only reward that is going to work, what is going to work is the cognitive factors of how you think and something like that. And the last section that we are going to do today is something called observation learning. So, what is observation learning? Observation learning is the acquisition of new forms of behavior, information or concepts through exposure to others and consequences that they can experience. As you can see, the father, when he is tilting his back at a 45-degree angle, and the child sees that this is the best way, or child sees that the father can effortlessly move the back, the child also tilts the back at 45-degree and starts moving forward. So, basically what is observation learning? Observation learning is a process where you actually see someone act in a certain way, and when you see him getting rewarded or awarded because of their act, you follow that particular behavior because you want to get awarded in a similar way. Now, this is the consequence, or this is the demonstration of Albert Bandura's aggressiveness principle. So, what happens here is that Albert Bandura took a group of people or group of children and showed them aggressive movie. So, one group of children saw an aggressive movie, the other group of children saw a non-aggressive movie, and after that they were put in a room after the aggressive and the non-aggressive movie. So, aggressive group was put in a room with a Bobo doll, and the non-aggressive group was also put in a room with a Bobo doll. Now, children who actually saw aggressive movie started beating the doll more, and the children who actually saw the non-aggressive movie started playing with the doll, which basically means that the observation of getting rewarded. So, aggressive group actually saw the hero being rewarded for doing aggression, and so they learned that, and the non-aggressive group saw that not doing any aggression also is rewarded, and so they do that. So, what factors, conditions determine whether and to what extent we acquire behavior information and concept from others. So, how do we learn from others? Bandura 1968 suggests that first, in order to learn through observation, we have to put something called attention must be directed to appropriate model. We have to choose whom do we want to copy. We have to find out the right model to be copied. Second, what the model does and shades must be remembered. We should also be able to remember what the model is doing. If we do not remember what is the act that the model is doing for which it is being rewarded, then it is not going to work in any way. The third is the memory representation formed at 2 must be converted into actions. Now, this aspect has been something called the production process, and that depends on something called the physical ability. So, whatever the model is doing, whatever you have learned from the model and put into memory, for that has to be produced back. Now, first that depends on two factors, whether you have the physical ability. So, if smaller children are there and they see a larger model taking a gun and hitting someone, they do not have the physical ability to do that, and so they cannot repeat that act. Also, capacity to monitor performance and adjust till it matches the original. So, the first is whether people have the physical ability, and the second is can you monitor your performance. So, if something goes wrong, if the model does not act, you remember, you pay attention to the model, you remember that, and from memory you are able to produce it. Now, once you produce it, of course, there will be errors. Now, do you have the ability to monitor what was the errors that you are doing in comparison to what the model is doing, and do you have also the ability to not only monitor it, but also correct it? If you have that ability, then you can actually learn from models. And finally, is the motivation plays a decisive role in observation learning. The last thing is, if you have no motivation at all to do the act, you will never learn anything from observation learning. And so, observation learning, the acquisition and later performance of behavior demonstrated by others depends upon something called extension, retention, production process and motivation. And production process is two-step. It depends upon the ability that you have, the physical ability, also not only the physical ability, but also the monitoring process. Can you monitor and adjust? These are the two things that is required for observation learning to function. Now, observation learning and aggression, a large body of research indicates that aggressions may be learned through aggression. Apparently, when children and adults are exposed to new ways of aggressing against each other, techniques they must not previously seen, they may add these new behaviors to the repertoire. And the last thing to be looked at is observation learning and culture. So, basically this observation learning also varies from culture to culture. For example, some cultures are very good in terms of observation learning, but at other cultures they are very bad at observation learning. So, observation learning is also dependent on certain cultures and the way these cultures respond to observation learning. Now, this part basically explains the fact that how aggression and observation learning works, because what happens is when somebody sees other person being aggressive and because of that he is being rewarded, we tend to align ourselves with that aggression and we do an exact act which is matching that aggression. So, that keeps in, or that brings us to the end of this section on learning, and what we did today was we looked at what is called instrumental learning. So, we went into the basics of instrumental learning, what it is, what does it encompasses, how it is done, and the basic principles of reinforcements and punishments. And not only that, we also looked at the factors, the cognitive factors and other factors which actually encompass the instrumental conditioning. Further to that, we also looked at what is observation learning, what are the factors of observation learning, and how does observation learning actually is performed. So, observation learning is a simple fact where you copy a model. Let us say you go to a restaurant. Now, when you go to a restaurant, how do you eat something? Let us say that there is French food. How do you eat something? So, you see someone around you who is eating. So, generally you go to a restaurant. I will ask you a simple question. Let us say that there is a food. So, which hand should you use the knife, and which hand should you use the fog. Now that comes from the fact that by observing people in the restaurant you learn these things, and that is what is observation learning. And for that there are 4 steps and you have to follow those steps, or you have multiple fogs. So, which fog should be used for eating the salad, for the food, and so on and so forth. So basically learning these things, or how copying others leads you to betterment or better learning, is what is observation learning all about. So, this section was mainly a second section, a continuity section on what we did on learning. Next session we looked into more related factor, which is called memory, and until we do that, from here it is goodbye.